One winter morning, you looked out at your yard and felt that something was different before you knew what it was. The feeder was still there. The fence line was still there. The tall pine at the edge of the property swayed slowly beneath a sky the color of cold steel. Everything appeared exactly as it had the day before. And yet the yard felt strangely empty. The wind moved through the branches in long, quiet waves. Dry leaves skittered across the ground. Somewhere in the distance, a screen door closed. But the sound you expected to hear wasn't there. No soft chatter from the feeder, no quick flutter of wings between the shrubs, no tiny black-capped chickadees bouncing from branch to branch as if winter itself didn't matter. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that makes you pause without quite knowing why. Maybe you felt it too. That moment when a familiar place suddenly feels unfamiliar. When something small has changed, but the feeling it leaves behind is larger than it should be. If you're new here, take a moment to subscribe before you leave, because what you're about to discover may change the way you look at every tree, every hedge, and every quiet corner of your yard. The truth is, on mornings like this, something remarkable is happening all around you. You just can't see it yet. And that's where things begin to get interesting. Because the chickadees didn't leave. They didn't disappear into the sky. They didn't abandon the places they know. In fact, some of them may be closer than they've ever been. Hidden in places you've walked past hundreds of times. Places so ordinary, so easy to overlook, that most people never realize an entire unseen world is tucked quietly inside them. And once you know where to look, you'll never walk through a winter yard the same way again. You have probably experienced it more times than you realize. A storm appears in the forecast. The temperature drops, the sky darkens earlier than expected, and almost without thinking, you glance outside. Sometimes it happens while standing at the kitchen sink. Sometimes from a favorite chair near the window. You look toward the feeder, toward the fence, toward the branches where the birds usually gather. And something feels different. Not alarming, just unfamiliar. The little movements that quietly filled the day seem to have slipped away. The yard feels larger somehow. Emptier. As though a conversation that had been happening all morning suddenly stopped the moment you stepped into the room. Most people never say much about this feeling. They simply assume the birds went somewhere else. Somewhere farther away. Somewhere beyond sight. But there is a reason these moments stay with us longer than they should. Perhaps because part of us senses that the story is not quite complete. You see the snow collecting along the edges of the deck. You hear the wind brushing through the pines. You watch bare branches bending against a gray winter sky. And somewhere beneath those ordinary details is a quiet question waiting to be answered. Where does life go when everything turns cold? It is a question older than bird feeders and backyards. A question people have carried for generations while watching winter settle across the landscape. And maybe that is why these silent mornings feel strangely personal. Because when the world outside grows harsh, we all wonder the same thing. Not just where creatures go, but how they endure. And the more closely you look, the more you begin to realize that the answer may have been hidden in plain sight all along. But that is where the mystery deepens. Because the places most people overlook are often the places that matter most. What makes this so fascinating is that most people are looking in the wrong direction. When the weather turns harsh, we tend to look up. We imagine distant forests, hidden valleys, places far beyond the edge of the neighborhood. We picture small birds escaping somewhere else. Somewhere safer, somewhere removed from the storm gathering over our own backyard. But if you stand quietly at the window long enough, another possibility begins to emerge. Not farther away. Closer. Much closer. Look at the old tree, near the fence line. The one you barely notice anymore. Its bark is cracked in places. One section curls outward just enough to cast a narrow shadow. Beneath that shadow is a space most people would never think twice about. Or the evergreen shrub beside the driveway, heavy with snow, its branches woven together so tightly that daylight barely reaches the center. Even the weathered fence post at the corner of the yard holds small imperfections, tiny openings shaped by years of wind and rain. To us, they seem insignificant. To something weighing less than an ounce, they can become an entire world. This is the hidden layer most people never see, not because it is invisible, but because it looks too ordinary to matter. The remarkable thing is that nature often hides its greatest stories inside familiar places. A hollow branch, a narrow crevice, a dark pocket beneath a cluster of needles, places you may have passed hundreds of times without a second glance. And yet, While the storm clouds gather overhead, life is quietly moving into those spaces. Not fleeing, not disappearing, simply slipping behind the surface of the world you thought you knew. And once that realization settles in, something changes. The yard no longer feels empty. It feels inhabited in ways you are only beginning to understand. What makes this hidden world even more remarkable is that it is not built on luck. It is built on preparation. Long before the first snowflake falls or the first cold front arrives, these tiny birds are already making decisions that most of us never notice. A chickadee weighs only about as much as 2 pennies. Hold that thought for a moment. Something that small faces winter temperatures that can drop well below freezing, yet somehow returns to the feeder morning after morning. Researchers have spent decades studying how this is possible, and what they discovered feels almost unbelievable when you picture it. On the coldest nights, a chickadee can actually lower its body temperature, slowing its energy use just enough to make it through the darkness. Not dramatically, just enough. A careful adjustment measured in degrees, balanced with extraordinary precision. But perhaps even more important than what happens inside the bird is where it chooses to spend those hours. As evening approaches, a chickadee does not wander aimlessly looking for shelter. It often returns to protected spaces it already knows. Small cavities in old trees, narrow gaps behind loose bark, places shielded from wind and hidden from the worst of the weather. When you learn this, something begins to shift in the way you see the landscape around you. That rough-looking tree near the edge of the yard is no longer just a tree. That dark opening in a branch is no longer an imperfection. It becomes something else entirely. A refuge. A carefully chosen sanctuary. And perhaps that is why these places feel strangely meaningful once you notice them. They remind us that survival is often quieter than we imagine. Hidden not in grand escapes or dramatic journeys, but in small, overlooked spaces waiting patiently through the storm. After a while, you begin to notice something that most people miss. Not during the storm itself, but in the quiet hours before it arrives. A chickadee appears on the same branch it always uses. It poses for a moment. The tiny black cap contrasts against the pale winter sky. Then it disappears into the evergreen near the driveway. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual, just a small movement, easy to overlook. Yet the next day, and the day after that, the pattern repeats. The same branch, the same approach, the same vanishing act into a place that seems far too ordinary to matter. This is where familiarity begins to deepen into something else. Because once you start paying attention, the landscape becomes filled with these small rituals. The birds seem to know the property in ways that you never have. They know which side of a tree blocks the wind, which cluster of needles stays dry after freezing rain, which hollow remains sheltered long after sunset. They move through these places with the confidence of someone walking through a familiar home in the dark. And perhaps that is why so many people develop such a quiet attachment to them. Over time, the birds stop feeling like visitors. They become part of the rhythm of the place, part of the morning light on the fence, part of the movement beneath the trees, part of the silence itself. There is something strangely comforting about realizing that while you have been living your life, these tiny creatures have been following their own routines beside you all along, returning to the same corners, trusting the same shelters, navigating the same winter landscape day after day. And the more you notice those patterns, the harder it becomes to see the yard as empty space. It begins to feel shared, as though another quiet community has been living just beyond your attention, waiting patiently to be seen. Then the storm finally arrives. Not all at once, but gradually. The light fades earlier than it should. Clouds gather in heavy layers above the trees. The air takes on that familiar stillness that often comes before difficult weather. By late afternoon, the yard looks almost frozen in place. The feeder sways gently. Snow begins collecting along the fence rails. The world seems to be holding its breath, and this is where the story becomes larger than most people realize. Because while you are standing inside, watching the weather move in from the safety of a warm room, dozens of tiny lives are navigating the same event from a completely different perspective. Somewhere beneath a curtain of evergreen branches, a chickadee has already settled into a protected space no larger than a coffee mug. Somewhere inside an aging tree, hidden behind rough bark, darkened by years of rain and sun, another waits quietly through the gathering cold. The remarkable thing is not that these shelters exist. It is how close they are. We often imagine survival happening somewhere far away in untouched wilderness. Yet some of the most important decisions in a bird's life are unfolding just a few feet beyond the edge of the porch, in places so ordinary that they disappear into the background of daily life. And perhaps that is what feels almost profound about it. Entire worlds can exist beside us without asking for attention. Entire stories can unfold within spaces we stopped noticing years ago. The storm outside continues to build. Wind moves through the pines. Snow thickens against the branches. Yet hidden throughout the landscape, small pockets of warmth and shelter remain. And what happens inside those hidden spaces over the next few hours may be even more extraordinary than the shelters themselves. As darkness settles over the yard, it becomes almost impossible to imagine what is happening beyond the glass. The trees stand motionless beneath fresh snow. The shrubs become soft shapes in the fading light. The familiar paths and corners of the property slowly disappear into shadow. To us, it looks empty, quiet, forgotten until morning. But many people believe there is something deeply humbling about these moments. Not because they are mysterious in a supernatural sense, but because they reveal how much life continues without asking to be seen. Somewhere inside a hollow branch, a chickadee waits through the longest hours of the night. No audience, no recognition, no sign that it is there at all. Yet its small heart continues beating. Its body adjusts with remarkable precision. Its existence carries on within a space most people would walk past without a second thought. Something about that feels difficult to ignore. Perhaps because it mirrors something we recognize in ourselves. The unseen efforts, the quiet endurance, the parts of life that rarely attract attention but matter deeply all the same. Researchers can explain much of how these birds survive. They can measure temperatures, track behavior, and study shelter selection. Yet there remains a feeling that science alone does not fully capture. The feeling that hidden places hold meaning beyond their physical dimensions. A hollow tree becomes more than wood. An evergreen becomes more than branches. They become reminders that protection often exists where we least expect it. And perhaps that is why people feel such a strong connection to these stories. Because beneath the facts lies a simple realization. While storms move across the world above us, countless small lives are finding refuge in overlooked corners. And once you begin seeing those hidden sanctuaries, you start to wonder how many others have been quietly surrounding you all along. By morning, the storm has begun to loosen its grip. The sky is brighter now, though the air still carries the sharpness of winter. Sunlight touches the tops of the trees first, turning patches of snow into soft bands of silver and gold. The yard looks almost unchanged. The same fence, the same shrubs, the same quiet corners you have seen 1,000 times before. And yet something feels different, not in the landscape itself, but in the way you are looking at it. Your eyes linger longer on the old tree near the edge of the property. You notice the dense evergreen beside the driveway. You find yourself paying attention to small shadows tucked beneath branches and along weathered bark. Places that once blended into the background now seem to hold a quiet significance. There is a stillness to this realization. A feeling that does not arrive all at once, but settles gently, like fresh snow covering familiar ground. You begin to understand that the world has been fuller than you knew. That hidden within ordinary places are stories unfolding every day without announcement. Not because they are trying to be secret, but because they do not need to be seen to exist. There is something deeply comforting in that thought. The idea that life continues quietly beneath the surface of things. That resilience often looks small. That shelter can exist in overlooked corners. And perhaps that is the lesson lingering beneath all of this. Not simply where these tiny birds spend difficult weather, but how much beauty and meaning can remain hidden inside familiar places. Once that awareness arrives, it is difficult to lose. The yard becomes more than scenery. It becomes a landscape of unseen lives, quiet choices, and small acts of endurance that have been happening beside you all along. The next morning, the yard is alive again. A thin layer of snow still rests on the fence rails. Sunlight slips through the branches in long golden bands. And there, as if nothing had happened at all, a chickadee lands on the feeder. It pauses for a moment. Its tiny body catches the light. Then another appears. And another. The silence that felt so complete only a day before has quietly dissolved back into movement, sound, and life. But now you see something you could not see before. These birds were never truly gone. While the storm moved across the sky, while the wind swept through the trees, while the world seemed empty, they were still here. Hidden within the same landscape you have walked through countless times. The same trees, the same shrubs, the same weathered corners of the yard. Only now those places carry a different meaning. Many people spend their lives searching for wonder somewhere far away. Yet sometimes wonder lies inside the ordinary things we pass every day without noticing. A hollow branch, a pocket of evergreen needles, a quiet shelter waiting through the night. Perhaps that is why stories like this stay with us. Not because they reveal something supernatural, but because they remind us how much of life exists beyond our attention. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If you enjoy stories like this, consider subscribing before you leave, because there are still countless hidden worlds surrounding us that most people never truly see. And perhaps, somewhere outside your window tonight, beneath a branch you barely notice, a tiny life is settling into a place of shelter once again. Maybe it is only a bird, but somehow, it never feels like only a bird.